Hello everyone, thank you for introductions, thank you for being here, thank you for coming to this seminar. The project I'm happy to present to you is called The Imaginary Map of Literary Lviv, plus minus 1939. I will tell about that more in a minute. The project aim was to construct a map of literal life of Ukrainians, Poles and Jews with a special reference to Lviv's topography. And the map is defined as imaginary as it's based on the memoirs of writers. Memoirs of different groups of writers were taken as a source to explore experience of this historical moment of 1939 from various perspectives among certain institutions and milieux in the city. I will give you a short historical context of the focus of the project, and I will afterwards I will tell a few words, few points about the actual digital aspect of this project. The project itself is based on research of Danilo Ilnitsky and Viktor Martinyuk, who are historians of literature, and the project is published on the Lviv Interactive website. So my role in the project was, as a coordinator of Lviv Interactive, my role was to coordinate all the parts involved in making this project and making this project published online. An initial idea of the project was to cover biographies of certain personality, but later it focused on exploration of the literal landscape of the city and to take into account different actors that interact, co-influence and define this landscape. So this project was also a kind of experiment with working with networks for us, because before projects as a part of the Interactive was related directly to physical space, to topography, to the city. And with this project we tried to apply networks visualization and exploration, and put them into urban context, urban landscape. Narrowing focuses for the project, it led us to September 1939 as a referencing point when occupation of Poland starts and Lviv becomes Soviet. This moment of major political changes that also affected social and cultural life of the city, and dynamic of changes gives us an opportunity to explore character of literary life before September 1939 and afterwards, and see how it looked like and what it became. So minus 1939, the period before September 1939, the interwar Lviv it has various parallel processes in Polish, Ukrainian and Jewish literatures, and of course apart from language, apart from social status, there are philosophical and aesthetic ideas that influenced forming this artistic, intellectual and literature groups in the city. There were many of them. I just to name a few, I mentioned some on the slide, which are artists, Hrono, 12, Anum, trade union Polish writers. There are some, but there were many of them. And again, this microphone, is it okay? So there are many of those artistic and intellectual groups in the city. Those groups were basically establishing their spaces of interaction in the city, and they were various and they were very different. So it is a matter of consideration today how writers did interact during the interwar period in the city, but it is also a matter of consideration whether there were places of so-called betweenness, as it, for example, in previous presentation Martin called it links or bridges, when we go to the graph theory, and how those spaces looked like. What is also interesting to see in the landscape is whether the memoirs of writers could show some patterns of similarities or differences in their experience, and if we can compare those patterns. So authors of the project started looking of the research, started looking these places and spaces of interbetweenness. So another part, another period is plus 1939. So since September 1939, among toposes of literary life started emerging very specific spaces sanctioned by the official authorities, like Union of Soviet Writers of Ukraine, Lviv office of this union. And for the beginning, such spaces were open to basically all writers, but very soon it changed, and everyone had to have at least interview to be accepted to this union, be part of this institution, and be part of this specific topos place. Well, language aspect, as in the interwar period, there were this aspect of Ukrainian, Polish, and Yiddish languages. Here, after 1939, language aspect becomes less definitive for being accepted to the union or not, because political and aesthetic views and background of those writers allow them to be recognized or as writers. Or not, according to official canon. Usually it meant this being part of this union meant possibility to publish, to work, to have honorarium, and will have basic resources for living. So having September 1939 in focus, this project is mainly exploring landscape emerged around this officially established canon. Specific of personal memoirs gives an opportunity to look at this literary life not only from a perspective that was official, but also from a perspective of personal memories. It is also important to remember that maybe for the previous slide, it is also important to remember that in this period Lviv became a shelter for refugees from from other regions of Poland, from Warsaw, from Krakow, and many writers were coming there, running from war. At the same time, in Lviv there were writers coming from Kyiv and Moscow, they were coming here to Lviv in order to establish this officially Soviet literary life in this city. In this way, an institution, this Union of Soviet Writers, was supposed to organize official canon, and it became a center of interactions and influences between representatives of different literatures and different groups, as well as local and writers arrived to Lviv after September 1939. So the aim was to reconstruct character of these interactions by building a network, visualizing a network, as well as to look on similarities and differences of their experiences of these writers from the perspective of memories, of course, because if we talk about sources of the research, two things I guess I would need to emphasize here. These were memoirs, and these were from Ukrainian and Polish literatures regarding the period of 1939-1941. Memoirs were published in various time after 1939, so there's somewhere where memoirs were quite fresh memories after 1939, some were published later, as you can hear it on this list. It was published in different time. Some of the sources were transcribed from oral interviews, like for example, interview of Alexander Watt. So basically, it was like discussion about the period that later transcribed and published as a book. Some of the memoirs were written down by the very authors. I mean, I'm emphasizing this because it also influenced the way that people remember and publish their memoirs about the period. And of course, this list of sources is limited by the selection of the authors, because they work with these sources and they read it and deconstruct basically these memoirs in order to prepare this source for building a network. Methodology for the project was also part of the idea of the researchers Danilo and Victor. They took this methodology to look at by deconstructing those texts, those memoirs, look at three aspects: anthropos, topos, and tropos. Means like the aspect of personality, of person, place, and also some idea, pattern that is somehow presented in this text. For instance, university in this case can be studied as a place, as a group of people, or as an idea or activity. So basically, as a result, it was published. It was by reading those memoirs and preparing fragments, quotes out of these memoirs. Authors prepared the list, basically the first database of writers, so personalities, also institutions, different toposes that were present in CT for the period. And by reading this and analyzing this text, they were also looking at different ideas that were present somehow in those texts. In order to give some context to the network that was built and visualized, and in order to give this network some interpretation, it was used, like the connection between different nodes within this graph, within this visualization, are illustrated by those quotes. Out of those texts, we were prepared almost 200 quotes that illustrates those connections. There were also some texts about personalities, telling more about the context and the biography of this person from the period before 1939 and also after 1939, and so basically to give some understanding of person's life journey. Another text prepared by also authors is texts about institutions, about those toposes, telling more about urban aspect of the city. So this was an attempt to use this network and use this graph of interactions and connections and apply them to this urban layer and to topography. And this was made by using also those texts about institutions and places. During the process of deconstructing those memories and during the process of reading this text, it was prepared some, also it was found some similarities between in texts of different people from different backgrounds, similarities that allows us to also outline some toposes, some troposes, some ideas that were present in these memoirs, and that can show some understanding of the experiences for the period. So basically, we have these memoirs deconstructed in a way. Then it was constructed in a network based on these fragments of memoirs. And its primary role is to visualize the result, to visualize the work of the research, the result of the research by looking at what was the connections from certain personalities within these literary groups, and what was their connection between them, and connections to places, and what ideas were or what experiences were common, were similar for them. But it also, as a visualization, it is also could work as a tool for analysis, because by having this graph and having this visualization, and maybe I will show it on the website itself. By having this visualization, it is also possible to work with this material and to look at different options, how these connections between people, or connections between people and institution can tell us more about type of those relations, and there are some also these relations are illustrated by quotes. So basically, it is also possible for one who would use this website to analyze what are also a part of those three topuses that outlined here by the authors. What also are there some similarities or differences that is possible to find in this text. Of course, there are some, as for any project, there are some limitations that we should mention regarding this project as well. The first one is about sources. As I mentioned in the beginning, it was about literatures, Polish, Ukrainian, and Yiddish literatures. When it comes to sources, we have some limitation with Yiddish literature, because again, it's a matter of sources and a matter of. It also reflects historiography and scholar field in this topic. I mean, Yiddish literature. We were working with authors and researchers who are specialists in Ukrainian and Polish literature, and now we are another stage of the project for now is cooperation with a scholar who can prepare the same set of materials and same set, based on Yiddish language sources. So we started doing this, and it is not only useful for the project, but also for historiography in general, because by doing this project, we prepare also digital version of this, at least part of this text, and also translation. So basically, it will facilitate possibility to use these sources in other languages apart from its original, apart from Yiddish language. Also, another limitation which is related to the graph itself, because if we look at this, graph, if we look at this visualization, we can. I mean, the aspect is quantity of ties versus quality of ties, because here, if we look at this visualization network, this network doesn't show strand of relations or type of relations for us. And this is also a part that is in progress, because in our general database for the Lviv Interactive project in general, we build this possibility to look at the different types of relations. So basically, now we, for the next stages of this project or any other project that is related to, as you mentioned, it's a kind of experiments, or we are in work in progress. It will be possible to use different differentiation between different types of relations and analyzing it. And another thing is special temporal aspects, because the graph itself, the nature of graph as visualization doesn't. Well, it shows a very static in nature of this network. It shows it's everything, all the connections, all the interactions were simultaneously and synchronical. I mean, it happened all instantaneous rather than durational or and casual. So it doesn't the graph, the limitation of graph very often doesn't allow us to show this dynamic in space and time. And when we go to digital part, digital aspect of the results of the project, we can say that the first thing is the digitalization of sources. So basically, those sources partly, but started functioning in different languages in digital format. So this data was basically a database of texts were developed, and it can be used in further projects and can be referred to. It is also those texts and those nodes in the graph, those personalities and ideas and topuses, they are also cross-linked with actual locations within the city. So basically it is also GIS based, and basically when we read some text is also very often, if it has some relation to the space, then it has its link to its coordinates on the physical map. What also digital gives us is non-linearity of exploration of this information. So basically, if we, for example, has those texts and as sources, as memoirs, they are built according to narratives of the authors, and they're building as that. And here, once it was deconstructed and different fragments were taken out from the text and interchanged into one network, it gives a possibility to have different entry points to this project, to study this experiences and to study this networks and connections between personalities and institutions. And what is also mentioned in the previous presentation, what Martin mentioned about interfaces, which is also another thing for the project, because some scholars even call interface and visualization of networks using interface as a new cultural form. So basically, it's when we have a content and a form, so interface is another way to explore, another form to explore information, to study this information. And basically, it requires quite different skills than simply reading, because reading has some narrative structure, and it doesn't have this multi-dimensional nature. And interface is quite important here, and it leads us to another thing about the project, that it is also included into other project of the center, which I'm coordinating, is Lviv Interactive, which is sorry, I will open it. Which is a digital encyclopedia of the history of the city of 19th century, and basically this project tells also, it has like, but by its very interface, it has also a non-linear nature when you there are different entry points for studying the history of the city. And as I mentioned, this project also is a part of the Lviv Interactive. And for example, if you can also basically just narrow down the entire encyclopedia about the history of the city into this specific project, and then you will see those places of interconnections when the project of Imaginary Map has also places that are related to the imaginary map, but there also has some other stories, some other aspects in the urban life, and basically this way we can show how the place can be a part of very different stories, and how or not only the place but institution or personality as well can be within the city, can be a part of very different stories. And as for example here, it is a part of one of the theaters is a part of the imaginary map of Literary Lviv, but also a part of some other stories of the city. And this way we can visualize it by having this interface. Yeah, I just mentioned that. And another, I would critical, important thing for the project is for any digital project is understanding that behind a language of sources, behind visual language, behind language of visualization, there is also a very different programming languages that we as non-programmers or IT specialists don't even understand what are their what are their meaning, but they are quite important for this kind of digital projects because they also define the logic of the interface, the logic of database, the logic of it is later visualized and perceived by one who would use it. And I just mention it because it leads me to the issue of coordinating the project that has parts involved, parts with very different backgrounds involved, as historians of literature and programmers, for example. And it is important to understand that a historian of literature maybe could use Yiddish language in order to understand their sources, but a programmer would use, I don't know, CSS or HTML to later transform those sources to something that via interface would one use. And basically it is important to include in digital history projects and in digital humanities projects in general, I think it is important to include this technical aspect and technical specialists into the project from the very beginning, because in this way they become not only the parts that implement some tasks, but also the parts that can give some critical advisory and expertise how to shape the project from the very beginning in order to have the result that is intended to achieve. Well, I mentioned this, and just in order to give you an understanding of those parts that were involved in making this project, and also another part of acknowledgements to this. People just have a list of everyone who was involved in making this project, from doing research to visualization, programming, or translation. That would be it. Basically, I'm for sure didn't cover some topics that you are probably interested in, so I'm sure there are some questions on that.
Yeah, floor is open. Any questions? Maybe I can start with a question, perhaps. I wonder, with such a project, is there any kind of conclusion? Is there any kind of justifying such a project with saying, thanks to this project, we now know more? Because there's always a danger with such projects that you are captivated by the fantastic ways of displaying information, a lot of details, it looks wonderful, but it's not like a book where there's a question, then there's the main part where it's the discussion of the topic, and then there's something like the last chapter, the conclusion. What would be the conclusion here? That would be, for me, quite interesting to know. But we can also collect other questions.
You can hear me without a microphone, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I just don't like microphones. So I'm just curious if you could elaborate a little bit about Yiddish, and if it was just it was also a sort of a question with language knowledge, or it was just a question of availability of sources. I mean, what did it look like, for example, when you were looking before the Soviet occupation, before the beginning of the Second World War? What did Yiddish look like then? Did you look at newspapers, which were always sort of plentiful as well? And the other question is this sort of the question of categorizing the way you did by languages in particular, as opposed to, let's say, nationalities. I know perhaps this is not something we want to get into, but for example, let's say there was a Jewish community after the war that was primarily speaking Russian, as opposed to Ukrainian, as opposed to Yiddish, as opposed to any other language. Is that in any way that sort of conflation or deconflation, let's put it that way, of language and nationality, does that figure into the literary networks and the project as such? Thank you.
Okay. Should I answer or there? Okay. So the conclusion. It's interesting that you mentioned, as an example, illustrating your question, you mentioned a book. So basically, book has its linear narration that starts from the very classical composition that has some start, some introduction, some logic and composition, and later has a conclusion and a result. And it is true that this logic is very established and very understandable to us. But what also I think is important in digital projects, in many of them, when we want to not simply illustrate but also use a digital tool as a tool for analysis, is this non-linear nature of digital projects, where you can basically start working with it and build your own narration and find your own conclusions. But also what is present in this project and in this network, it was a result of the research of Danilo and Victor, and I would say that their conclusion here is, as they were looking for some patterns of differences and similarities, their conclusion were this very troposes, these very ideas that they were able to find out by reading those texts, by deconstructing them, but because very often it was very different experiences, but they were telling about, for example, the others. And later on, Danilo and Victor, they prepared their interpretation of what the others, what was the meaning of the others in the memoirs of writers that were used as the sources for this project. So basically, it was a try to interpret those sources and find those similar ideas and troposes in the project. But basically, it is also possible for anyone to find this in this network their own conclusion. And what is also important, I guess, for network analysis, and it was mentioned in a previous presentation, because yes, it's true that network analysis perfectly works, could work as a opportunity to analyze a big amount of sources, and then to find some, to filter and narrow down those sources in order to find some specific connections, specific patterns. So for big data, for when we have this big data, it is important, but also it is useful for visualization when it comes to, like here, several hundreds of quotations that have a possibility to build some network and to visualize the patterns that are present here according to the research. As for Yiddish literature and for Yiddish sources, of course, there are the Yiddish literature was very present in the city during the interwar period, and after 1939, 1939-1941 for sure. And again, well, it is not present here because it is limitation of sources and limitation of language, because there are not so many scholars here in Lviv, for example, that are working with Yiddish literature because the lack of the knowledge of the language. Because if for the interwar, and this is quite different, if for interwar period there were third of population was speaking Yiddish, so it was common language. It was possible to communicate these languages and read literature in these languages. Today it's quite different, and it is also shows like the status in the city today and in historiography as well. So it's less researched and less analyzed as literatures in other languages. And regarding, for example, newspapers and press, for sure, it is a very useful and very important source for basically for any language. But here, like trying to narrow down the focus and trying to narrow down make it feasible, so to say, the project, it was limited to only memoirs, so basically only to memoir sources. And I don't remember if there was a third question.
There was a question about language versus, let's say, nationality, because there's also,
let's
say, well, I guess they're not remembering the post-war Jewish community that came after the war. They're not really remembering it or So maybe it's not relevant, but this question of does language and nationality, that doesn't always match up, and how does that get dealt with?
Language and nationality for sure doesn't always match up, and regarding those Jews coming to Lviv and speaking Russian, again, it's another period. Now here in the project we have this very narrow period, 1939-1941, if it comes to sources. And but even for this period, and even for these sources, people presented here in the graph, they have very different background. These are not only people that we can, I don't know, group according to languages or nationality, because here, by reading even backgrounds of these people in the project, you can see that some of them were part of just artistic movement without any involvement into any political activities, but others were, for example, organizers of anti-fascist Congress here in Lviv in 1936, or some of them were from Warsaw, where they were part of other socialist groups. So basically, here people presented in this project, they have very different backgrounds, and language or political views are not definite for the project. What is definite and what makes, let's say, what makes someone present in this, or some place present in this graph, in this network, is memory of people that wrote their memoirs. And if someone mentions someone in this text or mentions some place, then it is presented and visualized in the network.
That's why it's imaginary.
That's why it's a imaginary map.
Yeah.
So, I have the question about this primary research made by Danilo Ilnitsky and Victor Martinyuk. So I'm interested in how that materials that they provided to you was look like in the first stage of the project. So it was like just quotes from these, or it was some tagging and so on, and what you made with this to make the structure that we have here, and so on. So how they prepared these first materials to give.
I should also say that the beginning of the project was coordinating by the previous coordinator of Lviv Interactive, Oksana Dudko. So I started working on this project when it was in progress already. But authors of the research, we were lucky enough that Danilo and Victor, they were able to work with another interface that enables us, they call content management system, CMS, this backend of our website. So they were able to work with it, and basically material that they collected, that they prepared in their spreadsheets and documents, they were able to transform into already database that is uploaded to our website. So later on we just needed to figure out how to visualize it and how to present it in the form of a graph, and how to make references to spatial aspect, to urban aspect as well, because it's also very interesting that working on topography, on spatial references, during this project, it also led us to some other interesting stories. And for example, by exploring places of interaction, places of living of those literature writers, we, my colleague Olha Zaryshnuk, who is also working in this project, she found out very interesting story about Neo-Gothic architecture in Lviv. And basically, the project itself led us to another project. Because we were exploring this urban context of this imaginary landscape, and then we ended up in another story about physical landscape, but also about architecture in general.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah. So first thing, I really like this network because for users it's totally decentralized, and you could make your own network, your own hub, because most of network visualization are already predetermined how researcher or IT specialist see in this situation. But I have a question: is there a possibility to add some quantitative data to this network? Because most of limitations that you mentioned based on fact that for this network main thing was the fact of communication, not intensity of communication, not type of communication. And if there is a possibility to add some, at least, I don't know, number of letters between these writers, or some number of references, it will change a lot. And I think if you could do this change, it will show more answer to hard question, what is like result, because here you see just relation, and with quantitative thing you could see also.
One thing I forgot to mention, and I should mention, thank you for this question, because there is some quantitative data aspects present on this graph, because people with larger icons, how to say, with this nodes that are bigger in the graph, they show that there are much more mentions and much more quotations, those entities telling about them or told by them. So basically, here the size of the each node also tells us what was the role of this person or the institution or the idea in this entire network, and it is done by actually quantitative data.
Okay, thank you very much.
I just want one comment to say that from the team which designed this, there was a close cooperation between an artist, Andrei Vinik. He sits in another wing of this house, and we have programmer Ljubko. So thank you also for this project that it came true. And
and
of course,
I mentioned this. Authors, there are so many.
There are many people.
And actually, Ljubko, but also there were other specialists in the team who work on that.